You began to plant the seed in people's minds. But I think in the process, you did create a media image of me that's far beyond, the reality of me.
And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. It was overwhelming me.
Hello again, and welcome to Serial Killing, a podcast. My name is Elissa Kerrill, and I am the host, writer, editor, all of the things. And over here, we talk about all manner of true crime at this point, but we also get the whole picture to fully explore the nature versus nurture aspect of people who commit these horrible crimes. If that's your kink, then you've come to the right place. Subscribe, like, follow. Everything is in the links below. This week's podcast will be on some women who did their upper best to take down as many Nazis as they could in whatever fashion they deemed necessary. As most of us assume, it wasn't just the opposing Allied troops fighting the war against the Nazis during the German occupation and invasion in World War II, or any other contributor to those wars. There were lots of everyday people risking their lives to try to help in any small way that they could. Today we're going to talk about a few brave women that joined the cause, so to speak. We will start with a young lady by the name, well, she has a name that I could not pronounce, but thankfully she went by Hannie Schaft. So let me take you back to May 10th, 1940, World War II, the Netherlands. Nazis have invaded the Netherlands. The invasion is accompanied by heavy aerial bombardment of an important city, destroying its entire historical center in just 4 days. They threatened another great city, and the Dutch surrendered on May 4th, 1940. The Nazi occupied this country and passed these anti-Jewish laws to exclude them from society and keep them from having any kind of real livelihood. The deportation of Dutch Jews to the death camps in 1942 was heartbreaking for the natives of the country. A sort of grassroots resistance began to form, and part of the Dutch population decided something had to be done. One of those resistance fighters was a young woman by the name of Hannie Schaft. She has a much more proper Dutch name, as I said, but my mouth will not pronounce that, so Hannie it is. She was born on December 16th, 1920 in Haarlem, the Netherlands. Isn't that cool? That is the capital of the North Province of the country, or was at that time. Her mother had been a Mennonite, which we have Mennonites here. It's sort of like the Amish. They're very deeply religious and very steadfast in keeping the old ways, right? It's just another form of Christianity, but it's very, very strict. That's the short version. So her father's name was Pieter, and he was a teacher. Sources made a point to state that he belonged to the Social Democratic Workers' Party, for what it's worth. Now, she had an older sister, but that sister had died from diphtheria when Hannie was just 7 years old. It was said that, from quite a young age, Hannie was pretty interested in politics and social justice, and her family would happily and openly discuss issues. Her parents loved her, but they were fairly strict. They weren't mean or anything, just, rules are rules, and they, kept a close eye on her, was how it was worded. Of course, they would be protective after losing their first child. This makes sense. And for all the intellectual and political talk and world affairs and so on, she was the opposite at school. She was described as quiet and mostly keeping to herself. The fact that she was a natural redhead didn't help matters either, and she was bullied for it, which is a shame. People spend obscene amounts of money to try to keep their hair that red. Not that I would know anything about that. Moving on. So in 1938, so 2 years before the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, her home, she began going to college and she studied law at the University of Amsterdam. Her dream was to be a human rights lawyer. And while at university, she befriended some Jewish students, Frank and Polak, and this escalated her concern for the Jews because she was well aware of the ever-increasing negative attitudes towards them. Now, Hani started writing articles in the university paper criticizing the segregation of the Jewish students as well as teachers. So by 1943, after the Nazis were fully occupying the country, the university students were informed that it was required of them to sign a declaration of allegiance to the occupation authorities, to the Nazis. But fiery Hani refused to sign that petition, just like the other 80% of the students, so she had to leave the school. And in the summer of 1943, she moved back in with her parents again, taking Frank and Polak with her, who they promptly put into hiding. So her sort of rebellious work began with her stealing ID cards for the Jewish people in actual danger. She then joined a group tied to the Communist Party of the Netherlands, only she didn't want to deliver messages or little things like being a courier. She wanted to get her hands on some weapons. Hani also began sending food and necessities all around supplies to imprisoned Polish soldiers. The Jewish were being rounded up at this point and being sent to the death camps and forced labor camps, and what Jewish people were still allowed to be around, what few were still allowed to be around, were met with signs on diner doors or cafe doors telling them that they were not allowed to enter. This expanded, of course, into the food markets, the theaters, and then pretty much everywhere. But there was a rather impressive Dutch underground movement to hide and protect the remaining 25 to 30,000 Jews, and from what I read, they were largely successful, which is fantastic. So while Hani was working with the underground resistance, she met two sisters, Truus and Freddie Overstegen. It's not pronounced exactly that way, it's the best I can do, but also from the local area, and the three became close friends. The trio was actually, as time went on, they kind of became a little feared by some of the German occupiers. Why? Well, thanks for asking. I'd love to tell you. They would complete missions assigned to them regarding weapons movement, and this was extremely dangerous, as you can imagine, because if you were caught being a part of any resistance, well, it was pretty much an automatic death sentence. She was assigned to and was successful at eliminating specific Nazi targets. She was really quite talented. But there was a sort of ritual and an art to her work. She would put on makeup, make sure she had on beautiful lipstick, and she would fix her hair, doll herself up. Another bonus was that Hani could speak fluent German, which could come in quite handy. Hani and the sisters worked together, and we will discuss the sisters in just a few minutes, but Hani took part in finding places to hide Jewish children, working out supplies for people in need, and stealing identifying papers, whatever they could do to help the resistance and the Jewish people. And it was said that they even bombed railways. But what Hani is really the most famous for was dating the Nazi soldiers. Now, with her natural beauty, she was easily able to seduce high-ranking German officers and lure them into the woods, where they would then kill them, or she would kill them. But there was one bit of instruction that she refused to follow, and that was the killing of the Nazis' officers' children. That was a no-go, and good on her. She also weeded out traitors within the Dutch community and made sure they paid for their offenses. Needless to say, it didn't take her long to become somewhat famous in the Nazi circles and was referred to as the, quote, girl with the red hair, and she was put on the Nazis' most wanted list. In fact, Adolf Hitler himself personally ordered her capture. Hani would then team up with a young and rather dashing man named Jan Boonkamp, who was also part of the resistance. Now, Boonkamp and Hani worked together to execute a Dutch police officer and collaborator named Willem Raget. It was said that Hani fired first and hit Willem in the back. Boonkamp was unfortunately shot in the stomach by Willem before killing him. Mortally wounded, Boonkamp fled the scene but was arrested not long afterwards, and he was taken to a hospital. Keep in mind, shot in the stomach, right? So there, in unimaginable, excruciating pain and delirious, he inadvertently gave Hani's name and address to the Dutch Nazi nurses who were pretending to be resistance workers. So the Nazis, in order to get her to come out of hiding, gathered up her parents and sent them to a concentration camp. Between her friend dying and them taking her parents, she backed off and away from the resistance for a time. And after 6 months, her parents were finally released, which surprised me, actually. But predictably, not long after, she rejoined the resistance. She dyed her hair black and she wore fake glasses. Anything to keep them from seeing that she had rejoined the effort. Hani fell right back into assassinating Nazi officers and smuggling guns and weapons around for resistance members, doing what she was best at. In March 1945, Hani was unfortunately captured at a checkpoint, busted while on a mission handing out illegal communist newspapers, and was immediately arrested. She was taken to a prison in Amsterdam, and after much interrogation and horrific torture and solitary confinement, Hani was identified by the roots of her red hair by her former colleague, no less. Hani was executed by a Dutch Nazi officer in May of 1945. She was shot just 3 weeks before the official declaration of the end of the war. She was shot in the head at close range, but it just grazed her, and she shouted back at them that basically she was clearly a much better shot. But another gun was brought out, and she was gunned down and silenced immediately. In November of 1945, she was reburied in a state funeral, and members of the Dutch government and royal family attended, including Queen Wilhelmina, who called Hani, quote, the symbol of the resistance. Hani was one of 95 people to receive the Dutch Cross of Resistance, and General Eisenhower awarded her a decoration, possibly the Medal of Freedom. She is a Dutch icon, according to sources. Area schools and streets were named after her, eventually. So rock on, Hani. Good on ya. So logically, we will move on to the 2 sisters that Hani had befriended in the Dutch resistance. We'll start with Miss Truus, who was the older sister. She was born on August 29th, 1923 in the Netherlands to parents Jacob and Trinty, but I could never pronounce that correctly either. Freddie was born on September 6th, 1925, so 2 years after her sister Truus. Now, sources said that their parents apparently lived on a barge. Fascinating. Just as Hani's parents had been, their household was described as very socially aware. They spoke openly about politics. In fact, their mother was said to have been a communist, and she had zero tolerance for anything outside of that. But I guess there was some discourse in the marriage, and after they had a son, their parents got divorced. As was customary, the children stayed with their mother, but they had to move into a small apartment together in the city of what? Well, you guessed it, Harlem. That's where Hani was. But it was said that the sisters, their little brother, and their mother were really living in poverty, so things were tough all the way around. And then, as they grew into their teens and on, they too began to see just how horribly the Jews and others were being treated. So Truus and Freddie would share their makeshift mattress to give up the space for the very people who were hiding for their lives. One in particular was a young Jewish couple. So the German occupation was already a whole thing, right? And the girls and their little family were doing what they could to help the Jews. And then one day, someone came knocking on their door to ask if the sisters might want to join the resistance, and they immediately agreed. At this point, Truus was 16 years old and Freddie just 14. They began their resistance work, right, by distributing resistance pamphlets around and leaving warning notices to the Dutch men to try to discourage them from being taken to Germany to work in the factories as forced labor, or narcs. So their work with the resistance got them trained in how to use weapons. They also took part in blowing up railways and doing what they could to otherwise disrupt the German occupation. The sisters also capitalized on Freddie's very youthful look. She kept her hair in 2 braids and dressed younger, and it was said that she could have easily passed for about 12 years old. So then she could get past the German officers and others and barely be noticed, carrying all manner of anti-Nazi propaganda, possibly weapons, whatever she could carry. Freddie and Truus were also said to have successfully burned down a Nazi warehouse and then planted a communist flag at the Nazi sort of ground central building nearby. It's badass. And like Hani, they also helped move around at-risk and hiding Jews to better hiding spots, or escorted small children around and also helped with paperwork. Now, it was said that Freddie was an incredibly good shot, right? And she actually shot and killed a Nazi officer while riding a bike. But Truus was nothing to mess with either. Now, this little bit of story gets kind of graphic, so clutch those pearls, okay? So Truus was walking along one day when she realized she was witnessing a Nazi officer with a Jewish couple's little baby, smacking it against a wall over and over. Horrified, Truus pulled out a gun that she had been carrying and she shot that Nazi officer dead. Honestly, I'd have done the same. The sisters assassinated a few key officers in the area, and kudos to them. And then the girls went as far as to begin to try to seduce Nazi officers. I think Freddie played more of a key role in this aspect of their rebellion, but I believe Truus did this occasionally. So Freddie would get all dolled up. I mean, she's stunningly gorgeous. If you're watching the video episode of this, you'll see. But Freddie would get all dolled up along with Hani, their new friend in the resistance, right? And sometimes Truus, makeup, lipstick, walk into these bars where German soldiers would have been drinking a beer, and they would flirt with them. They would make it quite plain that they were offering to sleep with these men. Then they would, as we know, lure them into the forest to execute them. On one occasion, Freddie got a man out into the woods, but they happened upon another male resistance member, and he shot and killed the soldier himself. So Truus and Freddie were, just as Hani was, asked to kidnap and potentially kill Nazi officer children, and they, like Hani, refused. The children were wholly innocent, they said, and I agree. Where Hani was eventually captured, tortured, and killed, the sisters survived the war. They did try to free their friend, but it had been too late. Truus went on to get married. She settled down after the war. She had 4 children. I read that she went on to regularly speak at universities and different schools about wars and anti-Semitism or other racist crap against Jews. In 1982, her book titled, quote, "Not Then, Not Now, Not Ever," was published. She too won awards and honors for her bravery in saving precious lives. She died in 2016 at the age of 92. Freddie served at the head of the Hani Shaft Foundation that had been established by Truus. She also married and went on to have 3 children of her own. She won the awards and the honors, and she died in 2018, one day before her 93rd birthday. That's amazing. And though there are so many others who did their part in being so very brave during World War II, trying to help fight the Nazis, including men, by the way, who I will cover at some point because we're equal over here, I do have one more for you, only we don't actually know her real identity, and yet she will forever be a legend. So one country that I feel like might get looked over as far as Nazi occupation was Czechoslovakia. They too were invaded in 1939, and the Czechs, due to geography and the shape of their country, I read, and of course other things, didn't really have the ability to fight them. And after they were invaded and the Nazis began to settle in, it was said that Nazi soldiers, as in more than one, R-worded, right, assaulted this nurse brutally. And as if that wasn't horrific enough, she discovered that at least one of them had left her with a sexually transmitted infection. And instead of getting any level of justice for her horrific ordeal, oh no, she was then ordered to care for those soldiers in the area. So of course she was closely watched and on, but she wanted her revenge, and she realized one very good way to get back at her attackers and their regime as a whole. She began to seduce the soldiers and sleep with them, thus passing on the diseases to them And I don't know what she was giving them, but after being with her, a good number of them died or otherwise disappeared. Now, the village that she lived in, who didn't really fully understand the assignment she felt she had been given, was labeled a woman of ill repute, if you will, right? A floozy, a harlot, if you get the idea. But once it began coming out exactly what she was doing, she eventually became a local hero of sorts. But investigations began, and the Gestapo eventually discovered what she was doing, and that was that for her. And if you've listened to past podcasts about various Nazis, you will remember that the Gestapo was a special forces kind of Nazi soldier. They were like the political force of Germany, or the political police, I should say. And they were especially known for their horrifying brutality. And once they found out who was passing these diseases to the soldiers, they captured her and swiftly executed her by gunshot. And then I read that a former lawyer, a guy, bought her house and lived in it afterwards and had a plaque created commemorating her efforts. So bless. She might not have been able to shank them, but she did her best. She did her best, guys. She did her best. And that is 4 different women that did what they could to try to help take down the German occupation and Nazi regime in their countries. So, I know this isn't really very psychologically motivated, but I just had to sort of celebrate these badass women. And again, we will do one about some men, not just soldiers, but the one-offs like the women, so we're nice and fair, because I'm quite sure outside of Schindler, there were plenty that were doing their part. But anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this. The next podcast is going to be a super kind of deep dive about things, and so I really hope that you enjoy this one. I hope this was like a palate cleanser, if you will. And if you are missing Murder in the News, Morning Murder in the News, that is on its own channel now. It's on Serial Killing Murder in the News, anywhere that you listen to podcasts. So that's over there now if you're missing it. And outside of that, guys, thank you so much for listening, because I know you could be listening to anyone else, but you keep choosing me, and I really appreciate that, guys. Thank you so, so much. Have a great day.
Anybody who killed more than 2 or 3 people was a mass murderer, and whether it was all at one place or over an extended period of time. And then in the early 80s, they came up with this differentiation called serial killing.